Okay, this is an update talk about the Iota asteroid occultation time analyzer. I announced this 12 months ago at the last Iota meeting, and I guess it's developed a bit since then. And this is a bit of an update of the things that have evolved in that period of time. One of the things I want to emphasize is that I went into developing Iota to make sure we had more than one independent tool to analyze light curves. I'm a strong believer in having independent tools so that you can check or compare results and identify start investigating why the results are different, where they come up with different results. And from my perspective, all of that is turned out to be a useful exercise, and it's working to that end. Next slide. This just shows where to find Iota in Occult. It's on the Asteroid Observations tab, just the small thing there for Iota. And next tab. No, next slide, I should say. When it first opens up, that's what it looks like. A very boring form. But across the top half of the form is a graphics area where you get to see the light curve and the analysis of the light curve. And the bottom part of the form is where you've got all the controls and inputs and outputs. Next slide. My aim with Iota, as I just said, was to create an alternative tool to analyse occultation light curves. A key point for me, which was following on from the pioneering work of Tony George and Bob Anderson with Ocular, is I want to have a tool which independently measured the D and R events as statistically independent events. Aim was to handle both line movie and Tangra files, to handle output from integrating cameras. A major issue for me was to have a very clear presentation of what is going on, so that you could see as much as possible how the light, the fit was made to the observations, and to try to make it user-friendly and have simplicity, which is a noble objective and something which is fairly hard to achieve in this area. Next slide. The basic methodology, which is now built in Iota, first off is an integrity check for timing inconsistencies. When I was doing various testing on Iota using real-life light curves, I started identifying light curves where there were drop frames and duplicated frames, all buried away in the data set and not necessarily easy to identify. So I put together a tool to identify those and to correct them. So if you've got a series of drop frames, you can insert blank frames. And if you've got duplicated frames, you can delete frames. In that process, one of the things in the Iota methodology is I don't interpolate light values between frames where you insert one in between. Iota can handle the situation where you say this data point is an invalid data point and it doesn't get included in the solution. So you can add and subtract frames without affecting the integrity of the raw data and maximize the correctness of the fit that you have. Having got a reliable light curve, The first step is to identify possible events, and this uses a cross-correlation analysis, and that's done using a test light curve which extends the whole length of the measured light curve. With a nice simple occultation, you'll get a very clean identification. Here is an occultation. If you've got low signal noise, you can finish up having multiple possible events. When you've identified a putative possible event, the disappearance and reappearance events are analysed by fitting a test light curve of varying transition duration using a chi-squared best fit analysis. That fit is limited to a single step. Iota at this time does not handle step events, which are characteristic of double stars. Having fitted the light curve using chi-squared best fit analysis, the uncertainties in the derived times are determined using a Monte Carlo analysis, applying noise to the test light curve. This gives an estimate of the uncertainty. It's not a straightforward issue to deriving the uncertainties. It's quite a complex issue, and it's one of those areas where I think there's no simple black and white answer. Anyway, having derived the time and uncertainty, the final step is to say, well, this is the point in the light curve where the event occurred. What is the time that corresponds to that point? And I have to say, and I've said this to numerous people many times over the last 12 months, sorting out the issue of the camera-based corrections, it took me as long to figure out all of that and get that working consistently as it did to get to the point of identifying the disappearance and reappearance events in the light curve. When you get into this camera-based corrections, the times and the VTI issues, it's all quite a complex area, and it is not amenable to a simple statement of you just do this. There are all sorts of things you need to understand. Anyway, next slide. When you first open up a light curve, Iota looks to see whether there's the video has got a timestamp with it, OCR. If not, you can, at the start of the measurement process, specify the time scale, and this is a form that allows you to do that. It includes on the right-hand side some text appropriate to VTIs, and there's a drop-down box to select your VTI, which tells you how to interpret the VTI timestamp or the VTI that you are using, then you can use just an NTSC or PAL frame rate to populate the whole table, or there are a variety of tools in there which I won't go into to allocate the time to that table. Next slide. Sometimes, particularly with Tangra, you can get a situation where Tangra will provide a start and end time, but not the intervening times, because Tangra's identified that there's a bit of an issue with the time base. Well, within Iota, you need to have a time base going all the way through. This allows you to populate the times according to the start or end time, or you can use the standard PAL or NTS frame rate. But it's an area where you've got to treat with care. If you look at this one, there's a box in the middle which is highlighted in yellow, which tells you that you can, it tells you that below what the calculated frame rate is from the given start and end time rate, timestamps, and this one it's 25.5 595 seconds, which is not a PAL rate or an NTSC rate, so that we know right up front that there is something wrong with the time base on this, but you can populate the table nevertheless, and as hopefully I'll get to the point of describing later on, you can verify the times later on if you're linked in with Tangra. Next slide. The integrity check. It's highly desirable to have an OCR reading of the timestamp. So if you've got an Iota VTI and you can get Line Movie or Tangra to do an OCR of the timestamp, do it because it adds to the integrity of the readings. The integrity check looks for irregularities in the timestamp sequence, and it also checks the measurements and looks for identity of measurements in sequential measurements. So if the star brightness is identical in two subsequent measurements, it will say, hey, these two data points, you need to have a look at these before you continue, because that might be indicative of a duplicated frame. And for interrogating cameras, you can check that the recorded number of frames in each integration interval is constant across the duration of the video. Next slide. Here's the slide. It's coming up on the screen, I guess, with the resolution stuff that's not overly clear. The left-hand side is a box which lists the timestamps of it, and on this particular video, this is a real-life video. I forget which event it came from. It's on the header there. Some of it I can't read that on this, but it's a real video, and roughly every 7th frame, an extra frame was added. The frame was duplicated every 7 frames. Right across the video, and it wasn't exactly 7. It was 7 most of the time, but occasionally it was 8 or 6 or something. The duplicated frames here, there's tools in the center column where you can highlight the frames, and there's a column on the right-hand side of the left-hand box with some X's in it. They're flagging to delete those frames, and there's a control at the bottom to update the file in the memory, and it will excise, it will remove those duplicated frames. So that you've got a video record which doesn't have excess frames or missing frames. It's got a proper time base with it. The right-hand part of the plot shows the light curve. The important thing here is that there's a series of vertical lines which correspond to the integration duration if you're integrating. And this slide doesn't really show it, but when you've got an integrated camera output, you tend to have a series of sections which are at a same height for the integration period. And if everything is in good order, the lines on this plot will align with the start of the integration block throughout the whole recording. But that's not always the case. I've seen some examples of integrating camera recordings where along the way one of the integration intervals hasn't been the fixed number, but it's been one less or one more, and so on. And you get a bit of a drift in the location of the integration. Again, with this tool, you can go through and rectify the video data so that it's properly aligned with integration before you start processing it. Next frame. If you're a bit sus about the observing conditions, you can do a simple Fourier analysis of the data and the plot. The top plot, which I think is one of Dunham's observations, Lots of noise, but when you do a Fourier spectrum down the bottom, it's a nice clean spectrum. It's got high peaks at the left, which is long frequencies, and a low level of peaks through the rest of it. The bottom curve, which I think came from a PC165EX camera, where you've got the lensing effects on it. You've got a horrible signal there, and below that you can see the frequency spectrum with significant lumps along the way. When you've got a frequency spectrum like that, there's serious questions about how you can extract the data out of that light curve. Measurements will be compromised in some manner or other. Next slide. The next step, and this is all happening before you actually start analyse the light curve, you can set integration, binning and normalisation. You can come back to this at any stage during the analysis of the light curve. You can go through and analyse it all and then come back to this point. For a good signal, you just effectively just click the OK button here. But where you've got an integrated signal, rather than having discrete peaks here, you will see the integration steps here. And what you do with an integrating camera is you bin the data according to the integration, which you do that using some of the controls down the bottom or just simple mouse clicks. Or you can bin it even if you've got a poor signal. You can improve the signal to noise by binning the measurements. And you can bin for multiples of integration periods. And if you want to, if you measure reference stars as well, which people always should do, then you can normalise the signal having regard to a reference star. So if you've got light cloud variations going through, you can smooth that out by using a reference star as the reference standard. Next slide. Event identification. Test signal extends to entire recording duration. It does a initial scan through with looking for events. I emphasise, well, not really events, but for a one-frame duration to set a minimum cross-correlation level for a real possible event. As the cross-correlation progresses, the plot will center itself on the most promising event, and you can see the cross-correlation bit growing. And what you need to look for a real event is a symmetric triangle with straight sides, a sharp apex, a peak above the orange region at the bottom, which is the minimum cross-correlation level, and the light curve being flat across the bottom. Next slide. Next slide. There's an event. This is from the Agamemnon event of 2 years ago, I think it is. Nice clean event here. Fair bit of noise in the signal, as you can see, but cross-correlation curve is that green curve which goes up just like a pyramid. At the bottom of the light curve, there's 5 orange bars. The Iota splits the measurements up across the bottom into 5 regions and does a mean of those regions, a mean and a standard deviation, and plots those across the bottom. And that's a typical light curve there with a flat bottom. Perhaps not as flat as one would like, but it's a pretty good light curve. Next slide. This is a bit later in that same event. Cloud came in, as it turned out, and so you got a serious drop in the light curve. You can see that the green line is not a nice symmetric pyramid. It's a bit of a lump, really. And the orange bars across the bottom, they don't align at all. It's not flat bottom. It doesn't have a sharp apex. The sides aren't straight. It's unlikely to be a real event. Next slide. This is those two events again, because they are fairly close to each other. The green line on this is a comparison star, which was measured, and you can see that through the first and real event, the comparison star light stayed high, and for the second event, the comparison light also dropped, confirming that that is not a real event. Next slide. The cross-correlation analysis can identify up to 5 events. If it doesn't automatically identify an event, or you want to explore possibilities, you can manually select a point along the light curve and say, I want to analyse this point for a possible event. You use that with the checkbox for plot and the button for add edit, and then just put the mouse on the along the plot, the point you want to analyse, and the position and width of the possible event for there will get filled in. To analyse an event, you click the event you want to analyse, and you manually, where there's more than one possible event, each event is analysed manually. Next slide. This plot looks fairly complex. It sort of requires a bit of time spent looking at what the information is at the bottom. The main thing to see here is the red lines on the plot region are the fitted light curves. There's a variety of parameters in the left half of the bottom of at the bottom of the plot, which control some of the parameters used to do the fit. But there's two areas on the right which are important. One is a box for the chi-squared fit for different transitions, which on this shows a series of boxes which are at the same level. And on the very right-hand end, there's an uncertainty range, and that's plotting the results of the Monte Carlo analysis. It shows you how many solutions it is finding at various possible locations for an event. So on this one, on the disappearance side, which you can't see on this plot, you can see there are two boxes of equal height, suggesting that there's two frames with equal possibility of the event occurring in those two frames. In the bottom box, which corresponds to the reappearance event, you can see one box is very high, which say, hey, this is the frame which it most likely occurred. But you see there's a small blip on the right-hand side, indicating that there's a small possibility that the event occurred in that later frame. Now, next slide. Oh, now here's an interesting event. Look at the bottom right-hand box, the uncertainty range. There's two quite distinct boxes there. And when you look at the plot, underneath the red arrows, you can see two possible disappearance events with two high data points, or semi-high data points in between. I'm not going to get into debate on here as to what you should do with this type of situation, but the analysis here is saying that at face value, there's a real possibility that the event occurred. Well, there's two possible times which the event occurred from that light curve. And it's a type of thing where you might be able to rationalise one over the other by mental processes and looking at it. On the other hand, there's visual processing of light curves when people just look at them. The possibility of these alternatives are often ignored, overlooked, based on preconceived ideas. This tool flushes these out into the open, and you need to think about them. Next slide. The accuracy of the solution can be visualized by using, in the chi-squared plots, boxes down the bottom. If you go to the very left one, you can plot the chi-squared light curves for all the possible transition things. And there are just 3 examples here. On the left-hand one, the chi-squared curve is a sharp V shape, and that indicates that the solution, the time, the event location is very well defined. The middle light curve is surprisingly common, where it's effectively saying, well, it's an asymmetric light curve, and you can say, well, the event was definitely not before this, but it could be a little bit after. There's some indefiniteness on the after side. And the third one, where you've got poor signal to noise, the chi-squared curve is very shallow, and that's telling you that the solution is not well defined. So on the third one, you'd expect fairly significant errors, uncertainties in the times, whereas the first one, you'd expect small uncertainties. Next slide. There's the issue of how do you identify stars that you've got physical diameter effects. Where you've got a real stellar diameter effect in there, the chi-squared plot down the bottom will have a shape somewhat like this, where it will rise and then fall. Sometimes you'll get a plot where it starts off with a, well, if the plot is flat all the way across, you can click along and you can get a fit that goes to all of them, but you should use either the first or the second box for the event. But where it's got a significant lump in it, like this one has, then it's appropriate to say this event was not instantaneous, it had a real transition period, and you select one of the maximum boxes, keeping an eye on the light curve to see what the fit is like. Next slide. One of the things I added some months ago, trying to sort out what to do when you have a case like this light curve, where there's, in the top light curve, there's a point circled in green, which the fit is saying this might be, the event might have occurred as soon as that, and you might say, well, if I look at that, not sure about that. There's an option available to say, well, let's treat that point as being an invalid point and see what happens. And interesting on this point, on this plot, if you treat that as an invalid or erroneous data point, the solution goes from that very large uncertainty to a very narrow zone of uncertainty. That's a tool which has to be used with extreme care, but it's there. Next slide. This is a form for, it's the final form on Iota. It's applying the corrections based on the camera used. At the bottom left, you select which video camera you're using. I'll be expanding that list to include a couple more cameras which people have suggested in the last 24 hours. For an integrating camera, you specify the number of frames that you've been integrating. And video system, if it hasn't been selected, you need to select either NTSC or PAL or some other one if that's the case. And IOTA does some stuff all behind the scenes and says, this is a time correction that's appropriate for that camera, and it applies that to the times. And it takes the times which you've come through from the VTI timestamps or you put in manually, adds these time corrections in, and in the center box gives you the final results, which gives you disappearance and reappearance at the frame with asymmetric uncertainty values, and then it gives the UTC of the D and the reappearance with symmetric uncertainty values. The time is adjusted to be at the midpoint of the uncertainty limits. Emphasize yet again the video camera, the time correction stuff, getting the time right, I found to be an exceedingly complex issue, and spent 50% of the development time of IOTA was making sure the time issues were correct. Next slide. Now, one of the important things we've done, and Risto's mentioned it, is the integration between IOTA and Tangra. Here I've got a screenshot, and it's a bit crowded, but at the top is the Tangra light curve. At the top right is the Tangra plot of what is being measured at the relevant point in the light curve. At the bottom right is the Tangra plot of the actual field. I think that's the case. And at the bottom, across the bottom, is the IOTA plot. And the way this integration works is you can put the cursor anywhere along the IOTA plot and right-click the cursor, and it will automatically position the cursor or whatever on, or the read location on the Tangra plot to the same plot space, and display what was being measured on that frame. So if on the IOTA plot you're looking at it and saying, oh, that data point there, critical data point, something looks odd with that, do a right click on that data point on the IOTA plot, and via Tangra you get to see what was actually measured on that frame. Similarly, you can position the viewing position on the Tangra plot, and it will position the line, the equivalent position on the IOTA plot. Very useful tool for if you've got a noisy video and you can, oh, sorry, I got sidetracked with some of the messages coming up. It gives you a tool to, when you're doing the analysis, to investigate what was actually being measured, which my view is immensely invaluable. Next slide. IOTA generates a text report, which you can view and save that. That's a bit small to read on the screen. Next slide. With a simple click of a button, when the buttons are shown in that little green area which is cut out at the left of there, you can save the plot in several different formats as a JPEG file, which you can attach to your report which you send to your regional coordinator. So very easy to create a plot which shows exactly what you've got, and so everybody can see what you're doing. Next slide. It's just repeating the point that Bristow is making the integration between Occult Watcher, Tangra and Iota. Call Iota from Tangra. Iota will generate measurement results with uncertainties. Close down Iota, those measurement results get returned to Tangra. Tangra saves them in an XML file. And so when you finish Tangra and then you go in and report your observation, Occult Watcher will say, oh, I've got this XML file. Do you want to pre-populate your report? And your event times and your start and end times and a few other things get pre-filled into your report. Minimise opportunities for errors as a result of miskeying. A very neat situation. The end result of all this and the way Iota can work semi-automatically when it's got a really good light curve is the step from loading the light curve into Iota to sending the report doesn't involve many keystrokes at all. You finish up, just measure it in Tangra, call up Iota, click a few things, and hey, it automatically finds the event, and here's the results. Close down Iota, close down Tangra, open up Occult Watcher, and send off the report. Don't want to do that. Don't want to emphasise that too much because that's the most optimistic scenario. Usually it's a bit more complex than that, but that's where we're at. Next slide. The detailed help file with step-by-step instructions and guidance on interpretation. And last slide. What I will do to help here, if there's any questions, I'll drop out a talk, and then if there's any questions from the floor, then I'll go back onto talk to answer them. So I can do that. Chad, thanks for that note. The save image doesn't work on all platforms. The save image should work on anything where the .NET framework is functional. If it's not working, that's a problem with the .NET framework implementation on the platform. Because the save image is a fairly standard call. Ted asked, when using mobile deployments, we don't have VTI timestamp during the event. Will we lose a lot of these benefits by timestamping only before and after? The ideal situation is to timestamp every event, every frame, because that means you can pick up any issues of dropped or duplicated frames. But life is full of compromise. The mobile deployment situation, if you're in the environment of doing the start and just time stamping a point at the start and the end, well, that's what you've got to live with. But what the data integrity check does allow you to do is to verify the frame rate. And if you recorded for half an hour with timestamp at the start and the end, and Iota says, well, the frame rate has come out as 33 frames per second, then you know you've got a problem. What you do about the problem? I don't know. And that's maybe where you start trying to dig into behind the video to find whether there's an internal clock stamp embedded in the video, which you can access. All right.